As documentary editors, often we focus so much on the information that your documentary feels more like a textbook. And when the audience feels that way, their minds begin to wander. And so when you hit them with an emotional moment, it doesn't really have any impact on them. Here's the key insight. People don't care about information until they care about the person sharing it. For example, think about the last documentary that stuck with you, that really resonated with you, that you loved. Odds are you're probably not remembering exact plot points or facts and figures from the documentary, but you're more so remembering specific scenes and how they made you feel and the emotional impact they left on you. Emotion makes that connection first, which then makes all the information matter. Today, I want to walk you through my philosophy of how I edit interviews into something that's emotionally gripping that forces your audience to stick around and watch. I've boiled down this methodology into a 3-step system that will help you squeeze every last emotional drop out of your interviews. If you stick around until after I explain these steps, I'll actually walk you through a real world example of how I used this when I was making my award-winning documentary, Mountain Turks. So first, let's start off with the problem and the more traditional approach to editing documentary interviews. Generally, when you're starting a documentary, you sit down, go through your interviews, pull selects that have, the clearest explanations, the most interesting facts. Then you string all of these ideas together in your timeline and rearrange them in an order that makes informational sense so that the audience can follow along with the plot and the events of the film. Here's the problem that we run into when we edit a documentary with this perspective. If you were to plot your film on a graph with the y-axis being the relative emotion of the film, you would have all of these neutral blocks of information with these little peaks of emotional highs and tiny valleys of emotional lows. Emotion first editing flips this completely. Rather than asking ourselves, what information do we need to pull from our interviews to best tell this story? We ask ourselves, what moments had the most emotional impact? And then we build our story around those. That way, any information that we add to our film, any context, any exposition, is serving the goal of building up to these emotional peaks rather than working against them. One way I like to look at it is that these emotional moments are kind of like structures in your story arc. To make them as high as possible, you need a lot of support. So the information essentially acts like scaffolding that holds this structure up. Without that scaffolding, you can't build a structure that's as tall. So in other words, you can't really build an emotional peak without adding the right information to get you to that emotional high. This allows us to ultimately further heighten those emotional moments, which in turn has the added benefit of making the information far more memorable. Okay, so that sounds nice in theory, but how do I actually apply all of this to my documentary? Step 1. Identify emotional anchors. So the first step is to go back and listen to all of your interviews. But this time, when you're listening to them, don't make note of the information. Just turn that analytical side of your brain off and just let yourself feel what the character's feeling. This is where you ask yourself where you felt most connected with the character, where you felt they were the most authentic to who they are, or where you ultimately just felt some kind of emotion. All of these moments are emotionally driven moments. We don't even really care about what the information is at this point. We just want to find moments where our characters and subsequently our audience will feel something. What we're ultimately looking for is the moment that could be the climax of this film, or if you're working on a larger feature film, the climax of a particular scene. And the climax doesn't always have to be this big, grandiose moment. A lot of the times, the climax is just the highest high or the lowest low in a particular part of your film. Sometimes climaxes are really subtle lows. It's the moment a character's voice starts to fry and tremble on camera. Or maybe you're interviewing someone who's very serious and it's the moment in the interview where they actually let their guard down and Smile. The important part is that within the context of this film, the climax is the part that reveals the most emotional truth. These are the little moments that we can then tease out and really build up into something bigger and more beautiful. Step 2, the scaffolding. The only goal of everything we add to the edit from now on is to support getting to this climax so that it has the most emotional impact possible. Now is when I finally go back through the interviews with my more analytical mind, looking for information. What is the information that the audience needs to understand why this emotional moment matters to our character? What setup makes the payoff hit even harder? As I said, think of this information as the scaffolding or almost like a ladder that helps the audience climb up to this emotional peak with you. Step 3, the payoff. Now that we've done all the work to build up this roadmap towards our emotional peak, there is one more thing we need to consider when we're actually delivering on the payoff, and that's pacing. I've struggled with this a bunch before, and I think it's a bit of a result of the ecosystem that us editors live in these days, where everything is attention grabbing, everything has to be quick bursts of action. The pacing's usually a lot higher pace compared to working on a longer documentary where the audience is actually giving you their attention for a longer period of time. And there has to be this innate trust that if you've put in the work up until this point to get the audience to that emotional place, that they're going to be willing to stick around and sit in that emotion for a while and sit and ponder it. So the best thing you can do once you've reached this emotional payoff, just let that emotional moment breathe. Let the audience really take in what just happened and trust that they're going to be right there with your character, thinking and reflecting in the same way that your character is throughout the story when these big emotional moments occur. Then once the audience has had a chance to kind of come down from that emotional moment, we move on to the next scene, and that's where you start finding the next emotional anchor to then build off of, whether that's a positive or a negative once again. Let me show you exactly how this works in practice by walking you through a real world example of how I changed a scene in my documentary, Mountain Turks. To give you some backstory, Mountain Turks is about a mountaineer and inventor named Eric who redesigned the idea of a mountain hut. In this scene, Eric is still in the process of designing and trying to build the first version of this hut. So he takes his idea to the alpine clubs of New Zealand that are full of all of his colleagues and peers in the mountaineering space and pitches them the idea to try and get some funding. Unfortunately, not only do they reject Eric's design idea, but they also poke a lot of holes in it and almost try and ridicule him. This throws a massive wrench in his plan because up until this point, this was the only source of funding that Eric was trying to raise in order to realize his dream of making these new mountain huts. Originally, when I was editing this scene, I approached it from more of an informational perspective, and I asked myself, what information does the audience need for this to make sense in a chronological order? I came up with something like, he takes it to his fellow mountaineers in the alpine clubs in New Zealand. They reject him and say no. Eric then goes and starts his own mountaineering club and raises the money in his own way from his own community. Now, it's not a bad scene, but from the audience's perspective, even though they're in the loop, they don't really feel anything. So how did I rework this scene to make it more emotional? How did this approach of emotion first editing help to make this moment where Eric gets rejected even more impactful? First, I went back through my interviews and identified a really strong emotional anchor that didn't make it into the original film. This is it here.
I sort of felt just a bit, kind of maybe lost, you could say, or unfocused.
In this moment, I could get the sense that I feel Eric's hurt by this rejection from the alpine clubs. There's a genuine moment of connection there. So this then became the emotional low of the scene. I knew that eventually Eric would come out of this scene on an emotional high when he decides to start his own club and forge his own path. So I knew that if I could make this emotional moment as low as possible with the material I had, that payoff of him starting his own club would be way higher and you'd feel way more victory for him. When you see someone go through hurt like that, when they come out of the other side of it, you just can't help but root for them. So then I worked backwards from there and asked myself, what is the information that the audience needs to truly understand why this moment hurt Eric so much? Why did this rejection mean so much to him? He knew these people. These are people that he's assumingly been on, mountaineering missions with. He's been a part of these clubs for years. These weren't just strangers rejecting his ideas. So I dug back into my interviews and found the following quotes. Christine mentions that the sheer amount of criticism really started to get to Eric. She also mentions that Eric's usually a very optimistic guy, but when he swings the other way, he really swings far in the other direction. Then I found a quote from Eric where he talks about how he felt betrayed by this community that he offers support to, and he expected support back, and instead he got met with ridicule. These 3 points became my scaffolding to help support that emotional low and help the audience climb down into the depths with Eric before we climb back up for the ultimate payoff. And with all that in mind, here's the final scene.
When you get the criticism or the doubts from other people around you because it's a radical new idea and it's like, oh, well, what are you going to do about the condensation and what are you going to do about this? And no, that's not going to be safe, or it's not going to be this, or it's ugly, or whatever. That can get at you after a while. He is usually really optimistic and enthusiastic, but then sometimes it just goes the other extreme.
With a lot of things in life, you tend to have a sort of clan and a group, and you expect support because you've given support to what they're doing, you expect in return. And when you just sort of get flatly rejected or even sort of ridiculed, I sort of felt just a bit, kind of maybe lost, you could say, or unfocused.
This low is much lower than the original low, and it gives us some space to let us sit in the emotions with Eric in this low point before he figures out that he wants to go off on his own. And when he decides to finally say, screw those guys and go off on his own, we're right there rooting for him because we see how he was burnt and we feel how that affected him. And so naturally, we want to see him come out on top. Okay, so there you have it. Emotion first editing. Essentially, the best way to inform the audience is to make them care about the information. And the only way we care about information is if we care about the people giving us the information. Once they care, your audience will absorb all the information you throw at them because now they're invested. So give this a try in your documentary and let me know how it goes. I think you'll be surprised at how much untapped potential there is hidden in your interviews once you approach it with the right perspective. If you go through this entire process and you still feel stuck, I've made a whole video on how you can actually take advantage of AI to help come up with different themes, ideas, conflicts, and even rough story arcs using your interview footage. If you want to learn more about that, I've made a whole breakdown of it in this video here. If you want to join a community of fellow documentary editors and learn more about editing as well as get some free downloads, feel free to join my free tier of Patreon in the description. That's it from me for today, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.